projects that we've been testing in the bond ballot language are building that high school in Menifee, completing Paris High School in a single completion phase, expanding physical education and athletic facilities to support student health, safety, and fitness. That's the gymnasium at CMI. And then the last two bullets there have to do with CTE and STEAM, which of course is incorporated into all of our projects, and we want that district-wide. I know Hector did a great presentation last month that went over the projects in detail, so we won't do that again today, but just a reminder, these are the 3 priority improvement projects that we've been talking about district-wide from this bond measure. And I'm now going to invite Scott Smith up to talk to you about how are we going to pay for everything I just showed you.
Okay. All right. Hi, Scott Smith, CSG Advisors. I've been working with the school district in this role since 2009. A long time. Yeah. Through the last, I think what we've done so far, we've worked on the CFD 92-1, 91-1, and we worked through the Measure T, prior to the Measure T process, when it was still a ballot measure, and then the first 2 series of Measure T, the 2013 and the 2015 bonds. So, so we have 3 sources of funding components for our plan, and the big one, of course, is the 2018 election, which the funding amount we project is the $148 million. A third series that would come in, so that would happen if the measure is successful. We would immediately start working on that bond issue, and we would hope to be ready with that bond issue in roughly spring of 2019. The second source of funding would be Series C of Measure T, and that we would project as the spend down of the 2018 election bonds would be, for the most part used up. We would go to market for Series C, and we estimate under certain conditions, assumptions about assessed valuation growth and other and just market factors. We're building in certain interest rate assumptions and a buffer of interest rate assumptions given how far out in the market we're talking about. We think would raise about $55 million in net proceeds for projects. And then a third source would be certificates of participation that would be paid from residual revenues of CFD 92-1. So CFD 92-1 currently, for the most part, revenues are used to pay for CFD bonds that were issued by the district. I believe it was in 2015. And what we have found is with the continuing growth of the Menifee area and revenues from that CFD, when that CFD was formed, it was a ballot measure, and what was approved by the voters was a bonded indebtedness limit. That CFD has reached its bonded indebtedness limit, but continues to have new growth in the district and a considerable amount of residual revenues. And so just as the first issue was completed by the district back in the early, I think it was 2004, 2005, what the district did at that time was the district was still growing, and so we issued certificates of participation, which are like lease revenue bonds. And what we do in this case is the residual revenues, so revenues after paying debt service on the CFD bonds that are left over, those are available to pay debt service on the COPs, and therefore it provides a facility for the school district to basically leverage those special tax revenues and borrow more funds. And we believe, at least with the development that's occurred out there so far today, and with a fairly large interest rate cushion, we believe we can raise another $25 million from that funding source. So the key structuring issues that we have going forward with this financing plan, for one, with the general obligation bonds. So for the 2018 election single series, the 2012 election Series C, we have to comply with AB 182. This was a measure that was adopted by the state to protect taxpayers. What the legislature was concerned about at that time, as you may recall, was to limit the use of capital appreciation bonds. How they intend to do this is by limiting the ratio of debt service to principal that's paid on the bonds. It can be no more than 4 times. Second, they limit the term of those bonds to 25 years, and they require those bonds to be callable. In other words, the district can, over time, they can refund those bonds to deliver savings to property owners. So what you may recall, for those of you members that were here during the 2015 Series B bonds, this was the first bond series we had with the district where we had to implement elements of AB 182, which was me standing before you and taking you through a series of charts that showed how much capital appreciation bonds we were using, what the impact was of our debt service on taxpayers over the term of the bonds, and what the bond issue would look like if we had not used capital appreciation bonds. So we would be back in that circumstance again when we were coming to you to authorize the issuance of the bonds, say in the spring of 2019 or in 2020. We would be back before you giving that presentation to explain all these things, because in both of our projections of the 148 million, the 55 million, we expect that there will be capital appreciation bonds as an element of those bonds. But as we project today, well within the limits of AB 182, not a 4-to-1 repayment ratio, probably half of that, and so well within the constraints laid out by the state legislature. Second, what we are also concerned with is the assessed value assumptions that we look at to ensure that over the life of the bonds that we're keeping within the limits of the tax rate limit of the $30 per $100,000 of assessed value per parcel. And what we've done with your prior issues is we've looked at and we've presented to you the historical trends, what AV growth has looked like over the last 20, 30 years in the district, what it's looked like in recent years, what the recent trends are. We also look at what current economic market conditions are. Prior to the 2015 series, we were in less certain economic conditions at that time. We actually hired an economist to help us look at assessed value growth rates to assure us that we were keeping within those limits with our debt service structure. And then finally, we're also subject to market conditions, and market conditions are dynamic. And although we are in fairly low interest rate environment today, within what's a historically low interest rate environment, we are still seeing a lot of month-to-month volatility. And so what we've done with these projections is that we've added a pretty good sized buffer to our interest rate assumptions. So for example, for the 2018 election, we've incorporated about a 0.5 percentage point buffer in interest rate assumptions. And for those bond issues that are out in 2020, we looked at current market conditions and added a full 1.5 percentage points buffer into our interest rates assumptions. There's still growth happening in 92-1, so we're hopeful, knock on wood, that these projections are conservative for when we actually go to market, but obviously market conditions change. So let's see. Do you want me to take questions, or do you want to do questions after?
Do you have any questions now for Scott, or you want to go through the presentation?
So when we try to structure the bonds, we really look at what we think AV growth will be over the term of the borrowing, and we look at what are our limitations under AB 182. We look at our interest rate assumptions, and factoring those assumptions into a debt service model, we can at this time, we think we can only raise conservatively about $55 million. That's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah, and just to go back to our July study session, because numbers change in terms of all of the conditions Scott talked about. So if you remember when we talked in July, we were actually then talking about $140 million bond issue, and then Series C was still $55 million at that time. We would still have the additional. It's just a little bit more than $20 million because we have some on the Paris side left as well. But yeah, we want to make sure that we're not, being overly optimistic. Yeah.
Try to reconcile the difference in numbers in my head.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So the 25 from the COPs. So those would actually be their own separate borrowing. So whereas the 2018 election bonds and the 2012 election bonds will be general obligation bonds, these bonds are actually are called certificates of participation. So it'll be the 2020 certificates of participation, such and such project. And so what the bondholders are buying is an obligation of the district basically from its general fund to make debt service payments on the COPs. But what you're using is not general fund revenues, you're using the residual revenues of the CFD to pay those lease payments. That's correct. Yep. Yep. So that 25. So the 25 is not subject to bond or voter limitations from a ballot measure. It's
Scott,
separate from a
I think
ballot
what he's
measure.
asking is the other 20 million on that would make it 75 million.
The unissued Measure T
exactly.
funds.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, I understand the 25.
Oh, okay.
The COPs, we are going to pay the general.
Yep.
But they're still pending from 2012, 20.
Right.
So
Right.
we would still have remaining authorization. So once this plan is completed, let's say all the projects, we've had the grand opening celebrations and all of that, that $20+ million would still remain in Measure T authorization. And so whenever we had enough assessed valuation that we could then issue those, then we would, be coming back before you. I have those, so you don't happen to remember off the top of your head, Don. It's way, way out there.
But that would
So-
be be a Series D then.
Series D.
It would be Series D.
And there would be
Yeah.
nothing, honestly, to prevent us from doing a Series D for, say, 15 million and then a Series E. It's just, we would always have that 20 million plus of authorization to do when we could.
That's
You
right.
have that? Okay. Okay, I thought maybe we had that year. It's so far out, the year's gonna certainly fluctuate.
But it wouldn't be necessary to complete this
it wouldn't be necessary to complete the plans, but then the important thing is to know the money, the authorization for that money is not taken away from us either. So we would have that sort of in the coffers for later. So,
For the 153 million that we authorized, are we still being charged, the taxpayers, the community
Yes.
members? So we have been paying taxes.
not on 153 though, just
Only
on,
on the Series A and B?
correct,
That's right.
correct,
Okay,
correct.
perfect. And C, right?
Not C.
That
right.
we are going,
But you
once
would starting
it
in,
is,
on your 2020 tax bill,
oh.
if we did 2020.
if we did that. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
So, and as Scott was mentioning, the reason we don't want to issue all three of those together in 2019 is because what we've been studying, Fred and Hector and I, along with some of the team, is looking at, when we do all of these priority projects, what do those draw schedules look like? So when isn't it, we looked at, is it beneficial to wait, another year and a few months to issue those other two bonds because AV will have gone up, by then. But you have to balance that with what might market conditions be,
Right.
then. And then it's looking into the crystal ball, so you have to, weigh the pros and cons there.
Stakeholders ask me, we still have 20 million dollars they're pending. And then you are asking me for approve another one for 148. What would be the answer? Why not make it 128, the next one, and eliminating that, or getting the 20 and making this 28? I don't know.
Because
What would be the answer?
statutorily, we can only charge the taxpayers as a whole $30 per 100,000 on each bond measure. So
Oh.
they're separate elections, so it's per each election or per each bond measure. And so, I know it might seem simple to say, well, you have 148, let's ask for less here, but if we asked for less here, we'd have less project funds overall. So, because we can't charge the taxpayers more than 30 per 100 on one and charge less than that on the other. It has to be by election series.
Oh,
Right, so to stay within $30 per 100,000 under Measure T, we think we can only raise about $55 million, and that's it. So, what you would tell your constituents is, at least where AV growth is and what the tax rate is that we can promise to our taxpayers, we don't have enough bond capacity to fund the whole project. That's why we need another voter initiative to fund that.
under those other $30.
That's another $30.
$30, okay.
Yep.
Okay,
And that's what that top
Thank
row
you.
would be
The
whatever
148.
measure we call it,
Yeah.
yes. And
And that gets us our maximum, which is why it went from 140 to 148.
Oh, I
Because
see.
we're trying, we're trying not to phase the high school and so forth.
and that's all because of assessed valuation.
It's all driven by assessed valuation.
And for the most part, the assumptions we're using for AV growth are the same assumptions that we made in 2015. We didn't push them out, we kept them the same. And what we are seeing in the market, at least, it's only a couple years as a data point, but we're seeing those growth rates happen out in the market. And I think that we'll see them exceed that for the next couple years, potentially.
It's better to be conservative versus too liberal.
We hope we've been conservative.
So your projection is that those are going to continue to go up for the next 2 years?
We're hopeful they'll at least stay at what we set as our baseline. What we've been hoping is that we've been conservative and that we'll exceed that baseline.
Okay.
And perhaps that means we eke out $58 million instead of 55, but it's hard to say this far out.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
They are.
They are.
So all the taxpayers within the Paris Union High School District are paying on Series A and Series B. And so when you look at the life of because we have had this question in the community, as well. And so when you look at the life of the bonds, so, everybody's paying on all of them. And so we certainly we don't have the ability to just tax, certain residents based on the projects. But the Paris residents, as an example, when they ordinarily, if we could just tax them, we're done paying on their bonds, they will also then continue paying on the Menifee bonds as well. So by the end of the 25 years of bonds, it will have been evened. I like to actually simplify it and say, like, if Scott and I go to lunch twice, and he pays for both of us one time, and I pay for both of us the next time, we each bought ourselves lunch, two times. And so it's much more complex than that, of course, but it's really the equivalent of making sure that every taxpayer is paying only at the end of the day for their projects. Yeah. It is. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, they will, but everybody's still, each community's still getting an equal portion of the money that's coming in total.
Yeah, over the life of the entire series of bonds, everybody's paying proportionally for the projects they receive. But sometimes that as a standalone statement is difficult to understand. Okay, we'll now hear from I thought I saw a hand. No, Kerrigan Bennett.
Good afternoon. I am Kerrigan Bennett from Stradling, Yaka, Carlson & Routh. We're a public finance law firm, and I'll be talking a little bit about a process to a new bond authorization. If a new bond measure is considered, it should be conducted under the provisions of Proposition 39 and its enabling legislation that's known as the Strict Accountability in Local School Construction Bonds Act of 2000. And under that law, a new bond authorization would require, like Measure T before, it would require the vote of 55% or more of the voters in the district to approve it. In order to place a new bond measure on the ballot, it would require a resolution to be approved by a 2/3 vote of this board. So that's 2/3 of the current members, not those in attendance at a particular meeting. So we would need at least four board members participating in the meeting and approving the resolution. Elections under Proposition 39 can only be conducted on specified dates, and those include the dates of statewide general, primary, and special elections, and also regularly scheduled local elections that are held throughout the district. The next available date for a Proposition 39 election is November 6th, 2018. Now, in exchange for that lower voter approval threshold, Proposition 39 imposes some accountability measures on the district. And these include annual performance and financial audits to account for the expenditure of bond proceeds. They include the creation of a Citizens Bond Oversight Committee to review bond expenditures, reach a conclusion about the propriety of those expenditures, and make their conclusions available to the public. And finally, the incorporation of a detailed project list describing the types of uses that are permitted for bond proceeds. I should note that the district already has a bond oversight committee for Measure T. You don't have to form a new one. You can amend the bylaws for the existing committee to include within their duties the new ballot measure. For the project list, the goal is to incorporate and reflect all of those identified priority improvements that were discussed earlier. And in developing the list, the board must certify that it's considered safety, class size reduction, and information technology needs. These are priorities that are actually incorporated in the state constitutional provisions that allow us to conduct the election. Now, the level of specificity that's required in that project list, it's that level that will allow for a meaningful approval and review of approval and oversight of bond expenditures. If the list identifies projects in a way that's sufficient for voters, auditors, and the Bond Oversight Committee to determine which projects are permitted, that's a sufficient level. And finally, you've covered this point, I think, well in the preceding discussion, but just like Measure T, we could not issue bonds under this new ballot measure unless the debt service that is expected to, the tax is expected to be levied to pay debt service, the principal and interest on those bonds, would not exceed $30 per $100,000 of assessed valuation within the district. So those are the basic requirements and process for pursuing a new bond measure. Any questions, or should we move to the next slide? All right. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here with you again. Just a quick review before we jump into the survey, which is probably what you're most interested in, on AB 195. And you'll remember the last time I came to the board meeting, I explained to you that this was a new law that came into effect January 1st, and it impacted the 75-word statement that is on the ballot that voters read when they go to vote on any ballot measure that is increasing revenue. The requirements are that that 75-word statement now has to state the estimated annual tax collection, the tax rate, and the duration. It's had a particularly negative impact on school GEO-bond measures. And so there are many people across the state who are organizing, including community college groups, even cities who use GEO-bonds as a form of raising local revenues, and also many school districts to speak to legislators and explain to them why this language is a little more confusing. It's hard for voters to understand. It's packing a lot of information in a 75-word statement. And in fact, you'll see in the polling how it looks if we were to put it on the ballot here. So it's a very aggressive legislative effort to try to have it not apply to GEO bonds, specifically school GEO bonds. There will not be any particular legislation in effect that would change this. One of the current vehicles that they're using is to try to attach a budget rider. And so there's a lot of outreach to local, state, assembly members and senators to make sure that it is included in the budget for this June, which means we wouldn't have an answer about whether it would be applicable to your language until at least July of this year. So this is just an update on where it is right now. The district here has been in contact with all of your legislative members, as have many districts around the state. Our office is continuing to work with people to try to get this fixed in time for November bond measures, but right now we just don't have any level of certainty that I can tell you it will absolutely be done. Well, I think when you look at when Dr. McLarney comes up and speaks and goes through the survey, I think he'll show you how it impacts the 75-word statement when people read it. It doesn't just affect your potential bond measure. It has affected everyone all across the state. So many people are in a similar situation that you are, seeing how the confusion of this new language is impacting support for a potential bond measure. So, yeah, no, it doesn't impact anything that you already have. It's just as you look forward to a new potential bond measure. If they're successful, if they can have AB 195 not apply to GEO bonds, then it actually is better for you and many other districts, because it means we wouldn't have to include all of those specific items, which again you'll see in the packet, and when we go through the language, how it changes your language. It gives you less opportunity to talk about the projects that you would be able to do and people would benefit from if the bond were to pass. And it instead inserts all of this language that is, it's talking about raising millions of dollars annually. And most people just don't know what that means to them. And if I'm a confused voter, I might not vote in support of something because I don't know what it means to me.
I think what you were asking, Dr. Rouse, was you're thinking it's pulling GO bonds off being able to be used.
Oh, no, yeah, no.
Yeah, that's what, it's a little confusing to me too. at
Yes,
first.
yeah.
And the way to remove
Exclude,
It's to remove, they're
yes.
trying to get removed is having to put that extra language on
the
it.
extra
Yeah,
language.
extra
Oh,
language,
okay.
yes.
Yeah,
My
because
apologies.
I was going to ask you that.
Yes, yes, it's just exclusion from AB 195. Yes. In an effort to be very simple on the slide, I worded it incorrectly. Yes. So, any other questions about this? And again, I think, Tim, as you see the language, you'll see how it compares. So, all right.
Good afternoon, Tim McClarney with True North Research. Late last year, I had the opportunity to conduct for the district what we call a baseline bond feasibility study. And by baseline, I mean it was the first survey that we were doing for the district as you explored the possibility of a bond in November of 2018. And as you may recall from that presentation, the results looked promising, and that was in part of what kept this process moving forward, and it looked encouraging. And so, as Joy mentioned, one of the things that's happened since that baseline survey is AB 195. I've had the opportunity to survey for a lot of school districts since AB 195 became a reality. Some were districts that had done baseline surveys like you, using standard ballot language, the way we'd always written ballot language in the past or recent past. And so we were doing what we call tracking polls to see how AB 195 might affect them. Others were school districts that hadn't done a baseline, but we had in the past done surveys for them for past bond measures that had been on the ballot. We had a good understanding kind of what the community support level was for bonds based on those past surveys and election results. And to date, I've done a little over 10,000 interviews with voters all around the state looking at how they respond to bonds with AB 195 ballot language. And and the reason I bring that up is because as we go through today's presentation, I'm going to make some comments about how what we're seeing here for your ballot results with AB 195 compared to what we're typically seeing in other school districts. I will say you are pretty much right in line with what we've seen around the state for other districts that have explored their bond measures in what we call an AB 195 world. So today's presentation is actually going to cover the tracking survey. So we had the baseline survey last fall. We now did a tracking survey, and the point of this tracking survey was really to give us some up-to-date information on voters' opinions regarding your potential bond measure. AB 195 isn't the only thing that's happened in the past 6 months, right? Since we first came back and did that baseline poll. Candace and staff and Joy have been very active out, and Grant have been very active out in the community. I'm assuming you're being involved with this as well, and outreaching to opinion leaders and stakeholders and voters in different parts of the district to help them understand what your facility needs are, and to talk to them about both the past as well as what the future might look like in terms of school facilities. We did want to get a sense for how much AB 195 might impact voter support for your bond proposal. That was another part of this tracker. And then thirdly, again, it's an opportunity for us to gather some information that helps us, especially in this updated AB 195 world, understand how we might go about communicating with voters in your district about your needs and about this future bond proposal. Quickly, let me go over the methodology and then I'll jump into the results. This was a survey we conducted in late April, early May of this year, and we boosted up the sample size for this one. We actually, we had contracted to do 600. We wound up with 722 completed interviews with voters who are what we call likely November 2018 voters. These are voters who we expect to cast a ballot in this upcoming November election. You've got between 43 and 44,000 of them in your district. Now, because, as Joy mentioned, AB 195 is currently the law of the land, but there's also a lot of efforts happening to try and unwind AB 195 because of the obvious confusion that it is causing for voters with respect to how they look at bond ballot language. We're not certain at this point what November looks like, right? AB 195 could stay in place, in which case that we have to write ballot language that would be compliant with AB 195. If there were a budget rider and it were approved that unwound AB 195, essentially exempting school bonds from those requirements, we could go right back to the standard ballot language we've used all along, right? And currently it's a little cloudy as to what the future holds. And so what we decided to do with the tracking survey is to do what's called a split sample study. A random half of the voters that we included in our sample received standard ballot language, right? The kind of ballot language we can use in the past and the kind of ballot language we can use in November, provided that they change the rules about AB 195 and its application to school bonds. If that budget rider or other legislative vehicle doesn't pass and AB 195 remains the law of the land in November, we had the other half of our sample receive ballot language that was compliant with AB 195. And I'm going to share those two versions with you here in a minute so you see what we're talking about. But the point here is we wanted to make sure that at the end of this survey, we had good information on what the environment looks like in both of those scenarios for your bond. Like our baseline study, we use what's called a mixed method approach, where we're recruiting using both telephone and email. We are, for this survey, collecting data via phone as well as online. That's the same methodology we use for your baseline. English and Spanish language, depending on the respondent's preference, all that's the same. Now, because this was a random sample of your roughly 44,000 likely November voters and not a census of all of your likely November voters, it has what's known as a margin of error due to sampling. And in this case, that's plus or minus just over it's about 3.6% overall. What that means is for questions that were answered by all 722 respondents, we can be 95% confident that the results in the survey that I'm going to share with you are within 3.6% of what we would have found had we spoken with all voters. Now, because we split sampled the ballot language, we tested two different versions. The margins of error around the ballot language are a little higher. They're about plus or minus 5%. Okay, so on to the results. Share with you first the opening question of the survey, which is what we call our importance of issues question. And for each of the issues there on the slide, we simply ask voters to tell us how important it is to them. Is it extremely important or very important, which are represented by the dark blue and medium blue bars? Or is it somewhat important or not at all important, which is represented by that negative space off to the right? We always ask these in a random order, but we sorted them here from high to low based on that combined percentage of folks who said it was either extremely or very important. And we asked this question really for two reasons. One is it's a nice warm-up, kind of gets voters thinking about local issues at the outset of the interview. But it's also an opportunity for us to understand how the issue of improving the quality of education in local schools stacks up against some of these other issues that also compete for tax dollars, as well as that issue of preventing local tax increases, right? It's kind of a rough rule of thumb, but it makes a lot of sense that if voters place improving the quality of education in local schools towards the top of their list in terms of the things that they care about and think are important, and that substantially above that issue of preventing local tax increases, you're better positioned to move forward with some type of bond or tax measure related to education. If those items were reversed and they care more about preventing local tax increases than they do improving the quality of education in local schools, that tends to not bode well for some type of tax measure related to education. And so what you see here in your community is the number one issue was reducing crime and gang activity. At about 93% of voters say that's extremely or very important. Followed immediately by improving the quality of education in local schools. That was at 87%. And then maintaining local streets and roads, protecting local property values, and then creating jobs and improving the economy. At the bottom of the list was preventing local tax increases at 77%. Now, before we get any deeper into the interview, we transition right to what we call our initial ballot test. And the initial ballot test is a good opportunity to understand where your voters are at today on the natural with respect to this proposal, right? Because at this point in the interview, we haven't spent any time talking in more detail about tax rates or in more detail about the projects that could be funded or arguments pro and con. And so it's a really good gauge of where a voter is at based on just the information they have in reaction to this mocked up 75-word ballot statement. We talked about standard language and we talked about AB 195 language. Here is the standard version. And if you read this language, you can see we have 4 bullet points at the top where we get to talk and elaborate about what your bond measure would accomplish, right? And then towards the bottom, we specify the amount of the bond to be authorized, $148 million, and a couple of the accountabilities that are associated with it. This ballot language is very similar to the ballot language we tested in last year, and it's also very similar to the types of, or the ballot language we've used for other types of bond measures throughout the state for a number of years for schools. Here is the AB 195 version. And one of the things you'll notice right away is instead of 4 bullets, we've got 2 bullets, right? And the reason for that is, although AB 195 requires that you put a bunch of these new statements into your 75-word ballot statement, which I'll explain it here and show you here in a minute, it doesn't give you any more words, right? So the more of the sort of obligatory statements that you have to make about tax rates and duration and amount of money raised means you get to spend less words describing what your bond measure would accomplish. And so we were forced to be a little briefer at the top about describing what this ballot measure would accomplish. And as you look down the list, does this thing have a laser? It does. Okay, so you're looking over here, but I guess it's not going to work. Towards the bottom of the list, as you see the shall Paris Union High School District issue $148 million in bonds at legal rates. That's the same as it is with the standard language. From here, it gets very different. Levying approximately 3 cents per $100 of assessed valuation while bonds are outstanding and raising on average $10 million annually to improve schools. That statement, right, is what AB 195 requires of us. We have to state the tax rate, which is the 3 cents per $100 of assessed valuation, the duration, and the annual amount raised. What we have found in doing this kind of work around the state is this causes a fair amount of confusion or uncertainty with voters. And the reason being is it becomes very clear we're talking about a price tag here, but it's not, I'm not equipped, the average voter's not equipped to understand what that price tag means, right? There's a lot of voters who don't necessarily understand what assessed valuation means, right? And when you say 3 cents per $100 of assessed valuation, I know you're talking about a price tag, but it's not clear to me at the end of the day what I'm going to be paying. And that can create some uncertainty and some hesitation on the part of voters. And then you have $148 million. You've got a statement about $10 million. And there's just a lot of numbers being thrown around, right? And again and again and again around the state, when we've presented voters with this language, what we've found is it's troublesome, it's confusing, and it's off-putting for the most part. And so I share these with you because now we're going to shift to the results. And the results you see are shown here. On the left are the results if we use standard ballot language. At that initial ballot test with just the 75-word statement, we had 59% of voters say that they would support the proposal. We had 31% who were opposed, and you got about 10% who were unsure. In the state of California for a Prop 39 bond, you need 55%. So at that initial ballot test, we're about 4 points above that threshold required for passage. Referencing back to the baseline survey last year, we were at 61, so real similar to the results we found in that baseline survey. The other thing that is interesting, and you don't see it in the left column, but if you dig behind these numbers and you start looking at it by subgroups, one of the subgroups that we're paying attention to a lot is geography. And what we found is that at that initial ballot test, all 3 of the areas, the geographic areas in the community that we were looking at, support at 55% or higher. So you had Menifee at 56%, Paris at 72%, and other, meaning mainly unincorporated areas in the district that are outside of the Menifee or Paris areas, were at 55%. So that's also similar to the baseline. So when we're using standard ballot language, we're seeing results that are very much in line with what we saw last fall that were encouraging. Now to the right is the AB 195 numbers, and as you can see there, they're about 7 points lower. They check in with 52% support. That is right on the money with what we have seen on average around the state with respect to AB 195 ballot language impacts. Statewide, it's been an average of 7% reduction in support for school bonds. I've had some districts that have dropped 10 points. I've had a few that have dropped only 5 points. But in every case, there's a drop, and it's somewhere between 5 and 10%, and 7% is the typical number. And here's the first time, incidentally, I've tested it side by side, and we're seeing the 7% number there again. So we see that AB 195 is troublesome. Now, after that initial ballot test, we get to what we call our tax threshold section. And the point of this section is, if they haven't picked this up yet, based on that 75-word ballot statement, we want to make clear that bonds mean taxes, right? And then we also wanted to test a couple of the tax rates that could be associated with the bond, so we get an understanding of how voters react to that information. And the first way we do that is in terms of what we call a tax rate. And here you can see we're testing 2 rates, $30 per 100,000 of assessed valuation, which is the Prop 39 maximum for your district. And the second is $24 per 100,000 of assessed valuation. And so the nature of the question is, we put the blinders on a respondent. We say, we're going to forget about all the things we just talked about that this bond would accomplish. I want to talk about the money. And if you knew that your household would pay an additional $30 per 100,000 of assessed valuation in taxes if the bond passes, would you vote yes or no? So we're putting the blinders on them, focusing their attention on the price tag, and then we're testing first the high number and then the low number. And what you see is that there is some tax rate sensitivity here, right? At the $30 rate, we had 44% of voters say they would support. At the $24 rate, we had 47% say they would support. This is also strikingly similar to what we found in the baseline survey back in the fall. Now, the other thing we've learned over time is that, and it plays into the AB 195 ballot language confusion as well, is that not all voters know what assessed valuation means. And when you present a rate to them like this, for many voters, it's still not clear what that price tag ultimately means. And so we also tested a different way in the survey. And we say, all right, what if you knew that this measure would cost the typical homeowner in the district $66 per year? Would you vote yes or no? The $66 per year is the high tax rate of $30 per 100,000 of assessed valuation multiplied times the median AV for a residential property in the district. So it's what that middle house in terms of assessed valuation would pay if the bond were passed at a $30 tax rate. And what you see is that when you express it as an annual total, you get a more positive reaction from voters, right? Instead of 44% support, which we found on the last slide, you have 51% support at that tax rate. So this tells us that there is some confusion around the price tag when you talk about it as a tax rate, and that when you go ahead and do the math for voters and you explain that it's a fairly modest impact of $66 per year for the typical owner, you get more support for the proposal. Now, at this point in the poll, we transition to what we call the projects and programs section, and here is where we're trying to do 2 things. The first is we're now going to start to better educate this respondent about your proposal, right? Up to this point, we only had the 75-word ballot statement, and out of that 75-word ballot statement, there's only 30 or 40 words that can be devoted to describing what this bond will accomplish. Here, we get to unpack your project list into a variety of discrete projects, and as we're conveying this information to voters, they're learning more about your proposal than they had at that initial ballot test. The other thing it allows us to do is understand, of all the things you're considering funding with your proposal, which of these sort of rise to the top of the list in terms of priorities, and also which of these may be a bit further down the line. And I'm going to focus first on the numbers that are above that red dotted line. I'll explain the red dotted line here in a minute. But what you see is, first of all, that all the projects that we tested in the poll received a favorable response from your voters. There's no projects in here that I would call unpopular, right? Even the one towards the bottom, right above that red line, you had better than 2/3 of voters say that they would favor the district spending some of the bond proceeds on that item. Nevertheless, at the top, what we see are projects related first to STEM and skilled trades, so improving access to modern classrooms, labs, and career training facilities to support high quality instruction in math, science, engineering, technology, and skilled trades. The second one was in reference to career training facilities, and the third one was about creating flexible multi-use classrooms to support hands-on science and instruction and learning by doing. And the fourth one is safety and security. So out of that top list, what's interesting is you see those top three, it's a lot of science, technology, engineering, math, career training, right? Those are really three of the top four there. And that's consistent with what we found in your baseline poll. It's also consistent with what we find around the state in working with other school districts, that voters tend to prioritize those types of projects. Oh, the red line. We had one project that we only tested in Paris because it was about Paris High School, and it was to complete the final phase of construction at Paris High School, including additional career technology classrooms, performing arts center, and creating a single point of entry to improve student safety. 85% support among Paris voters for that project. Paris voters tend to be much more supportive of the proposal across the board, right? And so I think even among the other projects, this is one of the ones that they would prioritize. Okay, now obviously if the board chooses to move forward with a bond measure and place it on the ballot, there's going to be an election cycle, and during that election cycle, you're going to have proponents of this proposal step up and advocate on behalf of the measure to the community, argue for why it's a good idea, why it's needed, and why voters should support it. You might also have some opponents who stand up, say this is a bad idea, right? We shouldn't be doing this, and here's why. For this survey to be a reliable gauge of what the impact or ultimately what the outcome might be on election day, we need to be able to simulate that type of discussion and debate in the space of the interview, so we have a good handle on, how do voters react to this proposal when they are exposed to the types of advocacy arguments they will undoubtedly encounter during the election cycle. And also, should we get opposition, how much traction does that opposition get in terms of reducing support for the proposal? And so we do this by first testing positive arguments, and there's actually 2 slides here. And the nature of the question is, supporters of the measure say blank, you insert a positive argument. Do you think this is a very convincing, somewhat convincing, or not at all convincing reason to support the measure? And as you look down this top tier of positive arguments, you can see there's a lot of them that do get traction with the community. The number one is with respect to growth, interestingly enough. It says, our area is growing fast. We need to build additional schools to keep up with the growth and relieve overcrowding at our existing schools. For example, Paloma Valley High School was built for 2,200 students. It currently has 3,200 students, and within 5 years is expected to reach almost 4,000 students. What's interesting about this is that it's not only kind of making voters aware of the problem, it's specific, right? You have some hard numbers behind it, and that seems to elevate it as a positive argument here in terms of getting some traction with voters in a positive way. And so we test a series of positive arguments. There's a second tier here, and the red line below that, these are all arguments that we focused on Menifee voters. And it's worth noting that the top argument for Menifee voters was the district has completed plans for a high school in Menifee, has purchased the land, and has half the money needed to build the school. This measure will provide the rest of the money we need to build a new comprehensive high school in Menifee. Right? So at this point in the interview, voters have heard more about this proposal than they did at the initial ballot test, right? We talked about the tax rates in more detail, and that has a cooling effect on support for a bond proposal. But then we also had the opportunity to come back and talk about the projects that could be funded and convey positive arguments. So we circle back and we say, all right, now that you've heard a bit more, where do you stand? And what we see is that here again, we do have some differences between the standard language and the AB 195 language. Using standard ballot language, support ticks up to 61%, right? So we are 6 points above that 55% threshold that you need to be successful. By comparison, the baseline survey we did back in the fall, that number was 57%. So we actually are 4 points higher at this point in the interview than we were in the baseline poll back in the fall, right? Part of that's through fine-tuning the messages we're testing, right? Part of it, I think, is a reflection of the good work that the district's been doing and outreach in the community, and so we're up at 61%. To the right is the AB 195 language. Now, we also get a boost here, right? But we land just shy of that 55% threshold, right? We're just underneath the number we would need to be successful on election day using that cumbersome language. And then we test negatives. And the idea behind the negatives is we want to pressure test this proposal by simulating what we would consider to be a strong opposition campaign, right? We want to know how much traction might, that kind of discussion opponents get with voters. And so similar to the positive arguments, we say opponents of the measure say blank, you insert an opposition argument, and do you think this is a very convincing, somewhat convincing, or not at all convincing reason to oppose the measure? And we test fewer negatives than we do positives, and that's for a good reason. What we tend to find during election cycles for school bonds is your advocacy campaign has more boots on the ground, better resources, better organized. They have a louder voice than opponents typically. And so you simulate that in the space of a survey by testing more positives than negatives. That said, we didn't pull any punches with the negatives. We went after the type of negative arguments we would expect a crafty opponent to level at us, because we want to be realistic about, if they were to run a strong opposition campaign, what kind of impact might they have? So the first one up there was actually only asked of Menifee voters. I don't have the red line there, but the number one negative was just among Menifee voters, and it was, they promised we'd get a new high school in Menifee when we supported the last bond, but it was never built. We can't trust the district with this measure. And then the next one was, the district already passed $200 million in bonds to fix the high schools and build a new one. Now they want more money. That's not fair to taxpayers. So hard-hitting negative arguments, right? Question is, what happens afterwards? So after the negatives, we get a substantial cool down. With standard ballot language, we land at 52%, which is a little bit below that 55% threshold we need to be successful. We've got 41% opposed, and the rest unsure. This is exactly where we were on the baseline, right after the negatives, right? And what it tells us is obviously opposition matters, and that's part of the reason why it's important to reach out and build community consensus around this proposal, so that we mitigate that down the line. To the right is the AB 195 language. We're now not 7 points lower, but we're still about than the standard language, but we're obviously checking in below that 50% mark on the AB 195 language. So what does all this mean? I'm going to keep it short here, and I do welcome questions from the board afterwards. The first sort of takeaway for me is that when you compare this to the tracking poll that we did, the baseline poll that we did back in the fall, our numbers are tracking which was a promising poll. Fact of the matter is we're tracking real closely to that still, right? And that we see that on the positive side, the natural support for the proposal was above that 55% threshold if we use standard ballot language. There's a lot of interest among the community in the projects and the improvements that you're proposing to fund with this bond. And we have positive arguments that resonate with voters. And so that's the good news we were seeing back then. That is still good news here when you're working with standard ballot language. Some of the challenges that we saw then, we also see here as well. One is the sensitivity that voters have to the tax rate, right? And so that will be an important consideration down the line in terms of at some point we've got to nail that down. And we want to make sure that we're picking a number that's within the comfort zone for the community. And secondly, opposition arguments resonate, right? That was the case with the baseline, and we're seeing that here as well. So in terms of a recommendation, would be to continue sort of that opinion leader work that you have. That is really important in terms of building community consensus, right? Is to make sure that when voters take their cues from some of the important people in this community, and that's not just the important people that are sitting in front of me here, but also some of the other school districts and other community groups, that they're hearing support for this proposal, right? So that requires that the district continue to outreach to those individuals, as well as individual voters, to help sort of build community awareness and ultimately consensus around a proposal. Now, the other thing we've learned from this poll is that, like what we've seen in other communities, that AB 195 ballot language is difficult, right? It's causing confusion with voters. They're not as comfortable with the proposal when we're throwing a lot of words at them, some of which they don't understand. And so, as we continue down this line, as Joey mentioned, there's some efforts happening to try and unwind AB 195. We won't know the outcome of that until you're real close to having to make an official decision about putting a measure on the ballot. And so, you know, these efforts hopefully will continue and be successful because it obviously makes a big difference in terms of how voters react to your proposal. So with that, I end my presentation. I welcome any questions if there are any.
In terms of the key findings, what is the weight? Because I understand the positives, we have a natural support of 51%, right? 55%, I'm sorry. We need 55% of the voters to approve it, to vote yes. However, in all of the other ones, would you support this bond measure? I don't see anything, not even getting close to 55. The highest one was with the $66 per year, that is 51.2. So how much weight do you see? We don't have the 55
Right.
on, I will pay, but I want the good things, yeah.
Right.
All of us, we want the good things, but when it's about paying and
Right.
voting in favor,
So you're drawing attention to the fact that when, you know, if you think about the way the interview flows, we present an initial ballot test, which is similar to the language that a voter would encounter on the ballot if they walk in to fill out their and vote. They see that 75 words. There, initially, we had 58%, I believe, and then, and so that's just based on how they react with the information they have. We then focus their attention on the tax rate, right? The price tag. Support goes down when you do that. That always happens, by the way, in every school bond I've ever worked with. The moment you know, instead of putting the price tag in the context of a 75-word ballot statement where you're getting to talk about all the benefits of this measure at the same time you talk about the cost, if you just focus voters' attention on the cost, you're going to get a drop, right? What's encouraging is, though, even after we do that, we have a pretty explicit conversation about what the price tag for this measure would be, right? And there's, because of the tax rate discussion, we know that still leaves some confusion with some voters. Once you get a chance to talk about your projects and we have positive arguments at that interim ballot test, right? When we come back the second time, we're at 61%. So we go up. So what that tells us is, yeah, voters are sensitive to the price tag, and the more that conversation centers around the money, the more reluctant they are to support the proposal. If you can talk about the need and the projects, right, and do a good job reaching out to the community to help explain that, we nevertheless, even after the money discussion, land at 61%, right? That's a good, very good place to be. And then we have the opposition arguments, and then support falls off due to that, right? So when I said natural support is above 55%, what I meant was at that initial ballot test, right, before we have any deeper discussion with them, it's as if you walked out to your voters today, said, here's a 75-word ballot statement, I want you to vote on this. We're sitting at above 55%, which is where we want to be. So that's a good sign.
the fundamental question here is going to be in November, in the ballot, where I'm going to put the line, is going to be the money or not?
Well, this is where the AB 195 versus standard language makes a big difference, as we talk about. If we use standard language, we have a long history of working with school districts on bonds where we know that the way we've structured our methodology, and you present to them that 75 words, we have a good, accurate read on what happens in the ballot box. They tend to focus on what is this thing going to fund, right? And they don't get caught up overly in the dollars and cents of it. AB 195 ballot language creates a different experience for a voter, right? Because you're throwing a lot of numbers at them, right? There's at least 3 numbers in that ballot statement, and all in different units, right? So, using words that many voters may not understand, like assess valuation. And that creates, a situation where voters, if I'm a bit confused about what it is I'm voting on, I tend to hedge, right? I tend not to vote yes. I tend to vote no or be uncertain, right? And so with AB 195, what it ultimately does is it puts a lot more burden and onus on the district, but ultimately a campaign, right, to try and help voters understand this proposal beyond the reaction that they're going to get out of that 75-word ballot statement, right? And it's troublesome language. So I think if we can get standard language for this November, we're in a good spot, right? And we can, there's never a slam dunk, right? There's a lot of work to be done. Those recommendations that that bullet is, even if we're in standard ballot language, we need to put the work in to try and communicate with voters and build community consensus around opinion leaders. With AB 195, it just makes that hill a lot steeper, right, to climb. And so, I mean, we don't have to cross that bridge here today, right? And I think that since we don't know what the future holds with that respect, you want to keep moving down towards that. But we'll know here in a matter of a month and a half or so, you know, what world we're living in. And then we'll just have to make smart decisions at that point.
Okay, so that might happen. So what I'm
It might
hearing
happen.
from you is if 195 passes, yes, the amount is going to be there, or at least numbers that can be confusing for the board.
We'll know ultimately before you have to make a decision as a
Before-
board whether or not AB 195 language is required or not. We'll know that. Thank you.
Any other question?
Okay.
Hello again. So just a little brief review of what has already been done, because some of this is new, but much of it is things that you know or you've already attended. You know that the district did the 3 town hall meetings. You know, attendance wasn't particularly high, but it was an opportunity for anyone to come and speak their mind and share their thoughts about it, and also for the district to provide information about what would be funded if a new bond were passed. In addition to that, there has been a lot of community outreach, both in Paris and Menifee, focused on key stakeholders, but also community organizations that you know, are opinion leaders in both of those communities. There is a non-scientific survey still live on the district website where anyone can fill out and provide comments and feedback back. And the district has been reaching out to anyone who has questions or specific comments. We did just send a second informational mailer. It was sent on May 8th. Perhaps some of you received it. You should have all received it, actually. But it probably just came out in this last week. It provides more information about the projects and the outreach that has been done so far, and it talks a little bit about the growth and the impacts that that have on students. That was one of the things that we heard during the town hall meetings and some of the other outreach that was done, is that this isn't just a discussion about a high school, it's how this impacts students and their opportunities for classes and programs and participation in various activities. And that's a huge impact. So we did include that information on the second informational mailer that went out to the community. And then, as we mentioned earlier, we are continuing outreach to all elected leaders in your community, asking them to support a budget rider that would have AB 195 not apply to school district GO bonds. So that is our continued outreach. We will keep doing that over the next couple months. There will be more outreach and education. So again, just trying to get that feedback, engage support, and desire for this to move forward in the community.
Okay, so, as Joy mentioned, we'll all continue to the extent you are still willing to help. We definitely need to be out in the community. We've also developed something called walk cards. Particularly, Mr. Stafford and Mr. Bennett and I have talked about particularly reaching out, to Sun City residents and that sort of thing. So it gives us a piece of information to leave with them as we're having those one-on-one conversations. So that'll continue to be important. And we'll continue, of course, to watch AB 195 because that will be critical in terms of the decision that you have coming before you in July. It's why we changed the initial timeline that we had when we had originally planned for you to call the election in June. We certainly wouldn't want you to be doing that now with a worst case scenario. And so we'll continue the work that we've been doing. We'll be finalizing the project list and the ballot question in terms of the resolution that you would have to adopt to call the election and everything that would go along with that. We would be preparing we were thinking, I mean, we may not know by June 20th, but at the June 20th board meeting, we may have Kerrigan come back and present to you a possible resolution for, just for you to review, so you're not seeing it for the first time in July. If nothing else, we can show you the resolution and project list that was used for Measure T, so at least we would have an idea of what all is entailed with that. And then, if everything goes as planned, July 16th would be the special board meeting that you selected that date at the last board meeting to have you call the election and approve, different related actions that go along with that. So that's where we are as of today. We wanted to spend this time updating you, particularly with the polling results. And with that, if you have any further questions for me or for any of us, we're here. Yes.
I know that we have talked about the cost of high school number 4. About how much was 120, did we say, or 140?
Well, so what we'd said in July was we had $125 million for the construction, but we would need to phase the high school. We've been working extremely hard trying to find a solution, which is why we're talking about the COPS financing. We did ask Hector and Fred not too long ago because it's sort of like the interest rates and so forth that Scott was talking about, right? What are the construction escalation costs, going to be? Because that we're predicting that, right? And so we worked with a construction manager to give us an absolute worst case scenario so that we know what we're up against, and that number is $163 million.
And the reason of my question is because we are asking for the support of the community for 148 to build number 4, and it's just one of the things, high school number 4. And there are a lot of other things, improving this, improving that, that we are assuming, if I'm on this side, I'm not in Menifee, I'm assuming, okay, it's coming to me. And if it's 160, the reality is that we are not going to deliver that. I'm just trying to understand, because I don't want later on, once they vote yes, what happened? That's similar to what Menifee would say right now, right?
Exactly.
But we have an answer for that one because we said they were not matching funds.
Right, and we have an answer for this too, because there's actually two important things we need to remember. It's not just the $148 million that's part of this financing plan. So the new bond measure is one very big key component. That's $148 million. Remember, there was 3 lines on the how do we pay for this slide? It was called something else, but it's really how do we pay for this, right? And so 148 million was one of those lines. The other line was Series C from Measure T. That's 55 million. Scott knocked on wood and said, maybe that's 58 million. And then there's the certificates of participation, CFD backed or paid transaction. All of those things being today $228 million. So exceeding the 163, but exceeding because we have the costs for Paris High School and we have the costs for the CMI gymnasium in there.
Okay, and at the end of the day, it's going to be proportional because it's my understanding that based on the values of the homes, they represent 50% of the taxes, correct?
Yes.
Okay, because you mentioned at the beginning with Measure T, they wanted $75 million, rightfully so, and that's
half,
understandable
correct.
because it's half of it.
Right.
So 160, 148 of this one is going to be all of the money is going to be on that to that side, and we are paying that for that one, right? However, we are receiving only 74 so far out of 100 that we have issued. I don't know if I'm explaining myself.
No, I think you are. I'm
Maybe.
actually it's gonna take me just a second, but if you bear with me, I think it'll make it go faster. So, oops, I went too far. Okay, so how do we pay for all these things?
Yes,
Is
74.
this slide?
Yeah.
So let me just break it down, by the series. So, or by the financing component. So the 148 million would be split again, half and half. So the half for the non-Menifee is paying for Paris High School and CMI.
Yes.
Okay, so then we take the Menifee portion. Now all of Series C, that 55 million, is Menifee. That has to go for Menifee because that's all we have left is the Menifee portion. We've already used the Paris portion. It would be unfair to Menifee if we used part of the 55 million for a Paris project. So then the certificates of participation, because that's paid for from CFD 92-1, that is a Menifee community facilities district, i.e. a Menifee tax on their property. So we need to use that for Menifee. So really my point is what we're doing is being fair.
Exactly.
Which is our understanding of
Absolutely.
what we want to do and what we believe the board wants us to do.
And that is the objective of my question, because if we are going to issue the 55 and the 25, that is going to be 75 that all of us we are paying. So we're fine with Measure T. It's actually 80, but we're fine, right? Half and half. And if we go with the 148, we need to be, are we going to get the 74 also? Because it's not going to be enough with 74 and 55 to complete
And
the
25.
160.
And 25.
And the 25.
Yes.
Plus the 80
Plus the 80,
would be 150.
150, okay.
Yeah.
So as long at the end of,
Yeah.
we are equal. Yeah,
We are
That's
equal.
what I was.
Yes, that's the,
Plus we would still
At the end of the day.
$20 million of possible bonds down the road as well.
and those would go towards Menifee.
The other,
And that would only
no,
go
the
toward
ones
that would only go toward Menifee because only Menifee has bonds available for Measure T.
for Measure T,
Remember, there was 74.6 million,
yes.
and there would only be issuing 55.
55, so
there
there's
would
20
be almost $20 million
pending.
left.
Okay.
So, and that would only go for Menifee, and that would be down the road.
The D,
Series D,
Series
yes.
D.
Yes, and
Okay.
that would be down the road.
That's fine, I just wanted to clarify.
So that's how,
that-
yeah, no, it's a
that-
great
that we
question.
are, Yeah.
Yeah, and
equal.
this is how we have it structured and divided, you know, we didn't have a slide that way. Yeah, what Grant's doing, dividing it, moving it to the different, yeah. Other questions? Our area. You're my trustee.
Senior citizens, which, in the positive arguments, you know, you talked about how to message them or message to them, of course, you have the, I had it on the negative page, but how do we intend to have this discussion with them, with our plan, and how did they vote on Measure T? Which way did they go on Measure T?
Well, obviously overwhelmingly, I don't know, Joy, if you happen to remember Sun City, or if you,
Yeah, I was looking at the numbers and all areas were above 55%, including the Sun City area. And actually, we're very supportive. And I think some of the key to the support in those areas is a lot of the fiscal accountability that we talk about, you know, making sure that all funds stay local, making sure that the money is going to benefit those local schools, having an oversight committee, all of those are things that seniors have said were very important.
but specifically, in terms of how, what we did last time, and so since we have had that success, I think it at least, you know, gives us a start of a roadmap, is, it was a lot of one-on-one conversations. Much of that was led by former trustee Joan Cooley and former superintendent Greenberg. And so I definitely think, you know, Tony, you can be impactful, particularly since it's your area. One of the members of our bond feasibility committee, who was also a member, last time's teacher at Paris High School, lives in Menifee, Mr. Aaron Nearing. He's reached out to me and is ready to get into the Sun City community. Hopefully working, you know, side by side with, you know, one of you or one of us to do that, presenting at their community meetings, you know, just, you know, whenever we can get in front of them to talk about the bond, talk about how it's good for students, property values, those kinds of things. So we'll have to put an action plan together. Questions?
Ms. Toima? No questions. Okay, thank you. No question, Ms. Toima? No. Thank you, Ms. Raines.
You're welcome.
To adjourn the meeting. Okay, perfect. Okay, our next item is an action item, is to adjourn this special board meeting of the Board of Trustees. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Trustee Nelson, Trustee Stafford, please vote. Oh, I'm sorry. How can we do? You added her? Okay, perfect. Perfect. Action item 5.1 has been approved, 5-0, and this special meeting of the Board of Trustees ends at 3:07 p.m.